Welcome, everybody, to the show. Thank you for being here. I get the pleasure of sitting down with Dr. Carolyn Whitzman to talk about all things homes in Canada, her book, Home Truths. Thank you very much for being here, Carolyn.
Lovely to meet you, Brian.
So if you don't mind just quickly introducing yourself, give a little bit of a background of your academic experience and why you're the subject matter expert in this area, just so folks know where you're coming from.
Well, thank you. I'm not the only subject matter expert in the area, but I've been working on housing off and on for about 40 years. I'm currently a senior housing researcher at University of Toronto School of Cities. Previous to that, I was a professor of urban planning at the University of Melbourne in Australia. And before that, I worked for the City of Toronto for about 10 years. So I've lived in all kinds of places and I have experienced all kinds of housing. And my particular interests are in scaling up affordable housing and how you do it. And what other things can I say about myself? I live in Ottawa right now. And I'm talking to you from a coffee shop.
Yeah, I can tell. That's okay here. So I guess what I want to start at is one of the first thing that jumped out at me from, again, your book, Home Truths, was that the federal government had a more or less successful housing first approach that saw success and then was abandoned and delegated more or less to the provinces, where it started basically spiraling from there. Can you sort of expand on that a little bit and flesh out the concept to which I'm sort of identifying?
Sure. I mean, I'm a historian by training, so I'm always interested in how we ended up where we are today. And it's true that Canada has never been really gung-ho about non-market housing, but in the 1960s and the 1970s and into the early 1980s, about 14% of homes completed every year were non-market public housing, co-op housing, nonprofit housing, including supportive housing. And in 1993, the federal government formally decided that it wasn't going to get involved in affordable housing policy, that was going to be a responsibility of provinces. In Ontario, the biggest province, they in turn downloaded responsibility to municipalities. And in many other provinces, not much happened. So the proportion of non-market affordable housing went from about 14% a year. And some years it was 20, or even 1 year, 25% of completions, down to less than 1% of completions. And even in the last 10 years, when then Prime Minister Trudeau said, yeah, we need to get back into housing policy because clearly we've got a problem. It's only been about 2 to 3% of housing that's been completed that's not market affordable housing, so permanently affordable housing. So it's been improving from a low baseline, but it's still not where we were 40, 50 years ago. And it shows. I mean, homelessness is increasing. Housing need, particularly for renters, but really for everyone, is increasing. And a whole generation of young people under 40 are locked out of ever having a secure, affordable home, certainly in big cities.
Yeah. Myself, I can speak for myself as an sort of elder millennial born in 1983. So I'm at the early sort of beginning of that. So I'm 42 now, and I still fall within that sort of 40 or under problem of not being, you know what I mean? The down payment is the same cost as what a home was 25 years ago. So for people who are not familiar with the term non-market housing, can you just describe what that means? Because I grew up, just again, from my experience, I grew up seeing sort of what we call sort of government funded housing, which often resulted in being like ghettoized, or, you know what I mean? It was like dangerous neighborhoods that I grew up quite close to. So I'm familiar with sort of my exposure to that level of it, but can you expand on sort of what that means in a broader scheme?
Yeah, I mean, it has a bad rap, but at the same time, so as I said earlier, non-market housing is a big tent. It includes public housing, and 2/3 of the non-market housing is public housing of various sorts owned by a level of government, usually municipal. And there's another 15% of that stock that's co-op housing. So that's run by its members. You don't have to buy anything to get in. You don't get anything when you get out, but you do get a secure home. I lived in co-op housing for about 8 years, and that's certainly not ghettoized in any way. And then there's various kinds of nonprofit housing that's owned by charities or by community organizations. And that's about 20% of the non-market stock. And that's everything from, owned by a church or owned by the Shepherds of Good Hope or by the John Howard Society. And it does include housing with supports for people with intellectual disabilities or mental health issues, etc. So it's actually a very broad swath of housing. One of the neighborhoods that I talk about in the book, in fact, when I live in Toronto, and I'm in Toronto 1 week a month, I am in St. Lawrence neighborhood, which was developed in the 1970s as 1/3 public housing, 1/3 co-op housing, and 1/3 private sector condos. And it actually works really well as a community and has for the last 50 years. I don't think there's very much ghettoization about it. So the secret sauce there was a mixture of incomes and, some good architecture, perhaps. So despite the stereotypes against it, there's actually a range of people who live in co-op housing, sometimes in non-market housing, sometimes seniors, sometimes students, etc. So it can be a really a boon to a community.
I agree, and that's why I wanted you to describe all the different sort of options of it, because I grew up thinking that was government housing, you know what I mean, where there was a lot of crime, you know what I mean. I lived very close to it, so it's like that's what kind of I associated with it, and that's my own ignorance, not having been exposed to much else or really looking into it until recent years, and then reading your book and getting these concepts in much more detail. But probably one of the most crazy stats that I saw in your book, and then I dug into more resources through AI and CMHC and all these sources that you can find stuff on Canadian housing data, that the average price of a home in 2005 was $237,000. And then in 2026, early 2026, the data is that recent, it's $661,000 now, the price of a home. So
yeah, it's closer to 800,000 now, actually.
Yeah, depending on the city, these are averages. But the term that I loved in your book was unearned windfall, that was represented by many of the boomers and people who were able to buy houses, you know what I mean, even in the early 2000s to now. But there's like, how did we get here? I mean, I know this is a very loaded question, but how did we get here? And I want to get to talk about some of the solutions as well for some of the people that are listening that think they're never going to be able to afford a home, but there are some solutions on the way. But most importantly, like, what in your opinion brought us here, and sort of how do we begin to steer out of this?
Well, it is a series of decisions that were made really over the last 50 years. So one of those decisions was in 1972, when the capital gains tax was introduced to give an exemption to folks when they sold their property. And I was actually just talking about that with someone. In 1972, the average life expectancy for men was 70 years, and the average life expectancy for women was 75 years. So the notion was, you'd sell your house, you'd live in some retirement community, and then you'd conveniently die. You'd smoke a lot or whatever, and you'd die, not long after you became an empty nester, retired, and sold your house, and you would be able to live on the proceeds of your house. And that's part of the reason why the money that you made wasn't taxed. Now, it's great theory. Right now, fortunately, people live a lot longer. The average life expectancy for women is 80. The average life, the average life expectancy for men is 80. The average life expectancy for women is 85. A lot of people are kind of locked into their homes, even if they're still living in a 3 or 4 bedroom house that isn't even accessible anymore, and they don't use half the rooms, because there aren't affordable homes to move to. There aren't affordable rental homes to move to, and all too many seniors. And I'm a boomer. I'm not quite a senior yet, but I'm pretty close. Um, I I am concerned. I lived through my mother living to 92, and by the time she'd paid for assisted living for a few years and then long-term care for the last couple of years of her life, she'd blown through any money that she had saved through selling her house and not getting capital gains tax exemption. And we had to support her, which was fine for us. We're relatively well-to-do, but can be a problem if you aren't reliant on either the bank of your kids or the bank of mom and dad to buy a new house. So we confused housing as an essential place to live with housing as a great retirement investment. And particularly over the last 20 years, there were returns of 20 and 30% of buying up apartment buildings and spiffing them up and evicting the tenants who were there and doubling or tripling the rent. Rents have doubled in the last 10 years or so. There's also been a lot of money made by people buying and selling houses and flipping them, or buying a piece of land and flipping it a couple of times before it was developed. Another long-standing issue, starting in the 1970s, is that zoning became a lot more restrictive. I grew up in a triplex and then a duplex in Montreal with a single mom who had no problem affording rental, and eventually, as I say, became a homeowner. And at that time, tenure was much more secure for renters, and rents were a lot lower. So you could save money, you could go on vacations, you could do a lot of the things that are part of a really great life. But the more that housing became treated as something to make money with, and the less that housing became treated as something that was essential need, the more trouble we got into. So, I mean, we've been focusing a lot on the last few years, COVID and post-COVID, because that's when rents and house prices have gone up most ridiculously. But even by the late ooze, you were talking about 2008, in the 1980s, housing was at the international metrics of affordability, which is the median house price was 3 times the median household income. By 2000, that relationship had broken, and now in Toronto, the average house price is 10 times what the median household income is. In Vancouver, it's 12 times what the median household income is, which means that only very wealthy people can afford to certainly buy a first house and generally move.
One of the other stats that was pretty troubling for me was that 1 in 3 new or first-time home buyers are using the bank of mom and dad, as I think it was put, basically to payment. And there's an endless number of stats here. I could rhyme off forever, but at the risk of trying not to bore everyone, the average amount for a Toronto home that was gifted was $130,000 to help the first-time home buyers. So that is more than double the average medium home income in Canada. So we're talking, we've essentially moved to almost, for lack of a better term, a caste system, where you're basically born into a family that's able to afford property ownership or not.
That's absolutely true. I mean, we're in a situation of inherited wealth, which is at odds with Canada's values of opportunity for everyone. And it's particularly harsh on people who have been historically excluded from the home ownership market. Indigenous people are much less likely to have owned a home, say, 40 years ago. Black-led families are a lot less likely to have owned a home 40 years ago. And the trick now is, did your family own a home 40 years ago, and have they managed to get enough cash that they can let you have a home? And I mean, there are all kinds of implications of the housing crisis, but one of the really important implications, or the most disturbing implications, is that move towards inherited wealth as opposed to, a meritocracy. If students can't afford to live near where their vocational training or chosen university course is, let's say medicine, they can't study medicine. They can't study building. If you don't have the help of the bank of mom and dad, you may be locked out from home ownership forever. But increasingly, you're also locked out of secure tenure forever because, again, the system of protection for renters was so much stronger in the 1970s than it is today. 3% of renter households were evicted last year, and that is unacceptably high.
Yeah, that's another wild stat in a similar vein that you mentioned in your book is when Airbnb came to Canada, there were 25 hosts identified as having hundreds of listings of homes that they owned for rental. Many of them were making over $1 million per year from as profit from the properties that they owned. And by 2018, 20 to 40 something thousand rental units had been removed from the market. So just further, reducing supply as these are just become Airbnb properties. It's like these problems keep compounding one after another. Like where do you see this going? Like, is this going to get worse before it gets better?
I do fear it's going to get worse. There was a 50% increase in homelessness in Ontario between 2018 and 2024, and then it's only increased in 2025. We don't have the results of the 2026 census yet, but the Parliamentary Budget Officer has said that housing need, which are people in unaffordable housing who can't afford an adequate alternative in their area, is going to increase from 1.7 million households, which is already really high. It's about 12% of households in Canada, to 2.7 or 2.8 million. So I don't use the word crisis lightly. The title of my book is Home Truths Fixing Canada's Housing Crisis. I'm not using the term crisis lightly. We are in a crisis, and it does require really substantive measures to address it, or else we're going to, have a generation. We already have a generation that just aren't able to have the standard of living that their parents had.
Yeah, that's definitely an issue that's, I think, top of mind for a lot of folks who are anywhere around my age or younger. The models that seem to be working in Europe and in Asia and other parts of the world, like Vienna, for instance, trickle up housing economics using tenant participation in the design to get feedback and not only have them involved in the process, but offer it's in my interpretation was it puts dignity into the environment, of the person living there, given that they have some say in how it's going to go, which has a bunch of pragmatic benefits as well. Can you explain sort of briefly how the Vienna models work, or maybe places like Singapore that have figured this out a lot better than we have?
Yeah. So, Singapore is a really interesting example because when it won independence in 1964 from Britain, the housing stock was in terrible shape. And the decision was made that the first priority was going to be adequate housing for everyone. So it has a model where Singapore owns the land. It has a big housing development corporation, which doesn't mean that the government of Singapore does all the building. It means it contracts with builders. And 80% of the housing is public housing. And I'm putting public housing in air quotes because the land underneath it is owned by the government, but it's also ownership housing. So they built condos ranging in size from 1 to 4 bedrooms, most of them being family-sized condominiums. Singapore has a very small land area, so the only way that you can get everyone in there is through high-rise housing. And they're sold for prices today between 100,000 and 400,000. So in some ways, it's a kind of system that Canada might bridle at because it's quite government controlled. At the same time, it's incredibly cheap, and you can get loans from the government if you can't afford, $100,000. As I say, there's sort of a level of government control which is hard to imagine in Canada, and yet there is the example of Whistler, which is has the same kind of use. Can buy it for a certain price, but you also have to sell it basically at the same price plus inflation. And about 50% of the housing in that resort municipality is owned by the government of Whistler. It's both ownership and rental housing for the people who work there. And the reason why it is what it is because it was impossible to attract people to work in the ski resort without offering some kind of decent housing. And the housing is far more than decent. It's actually really lovely housing. So that model can work in Canada. The model in Vienna is simply for 100 years, they have been building non-market housing, mostly public housing, but also companies that are private companies, but their profit is limited to 5% per year, build a large part of the housing. And not only are rents super low in that housing, which is about 60% of the housing in Vienna, private rental and even private ownership is also super low because there's choices available. So it is possible in the real world to see systems where housing is affordable, where cities are super livable, because if you aren't spending 50 or 70% of your income on housing, you can spend it on dinners out and culture and going on vacation and even investing in retirement funds that don't involve evicting people.
So it sounds like there are small pockets of Canada, like you said, Whistler, that are able to make this work. Why is it not being adopted on a larger scale? Is it just the fact that there's too much of the electorate base is counting on this as their nest egg to derail this train that's kind of already set on its tracks? In your opinion, why do you think this model that obviously works elsewhere is not being applied here?
Well, I think there's two reasons. One is, as you've already said, there are, a lot of older homeowners who've paid off their mortgage who very much benefit from that system. I mean, I'm one of them. And it's, there's not that many people who say, please pay my taxes. But also, I think that there's belief that a certain kind of housing is the only way to live, like home ownership or single family houses, despite, many examples of very livable communities like Montreal, where I grew up, where multiplexes are the norm. So there's a lot of opposition whenever people suggest a triplex or a sixplex or whatever, a small apartment building, because they go, oh, that's going to bring down property values, ignoring
the NIMBY people that you mentioned a lot in
the NIMBY folks, yeah. Which, ignores the fact that if you want a place for your kids to move out in or a cheap place for you to live in once you no longer need a large house, that's how those things happen. And there's no evidence. In fact, there's kind of counter evidence that the kind of investment that new multiplex development brings and the kind of foot traffic, etc., is good for a community. Your school won't close. You have a better argument for more public transit. You have stores more able to reach customers, etc. So I am a fan of greater densities, definitely, and simpler zoning and quicker approvals. The majority of housing in Canada will always be market housing. So there's only two things that you can do, really, or two categories of things. One of them is throw everything at making market housing cheaper through allowing more intensive use of land, through lower development fees, through various other mechanisms. And the market housing has never been able to serve the needs of lower income people. So you do need a critical mass. I would suggest 20% of housing that is not part of the market sector to serve the needs of low and moderate income Canadians. At the moment, we've got a system where literally the majority of Canadians, low and moderate, but also median income Canadians, aren't having their housing need met. So clearly we need a new or improved system.
You touched on something really interesting there to do with the bureaucracy of the machine that is being fueled by all these surveys and zoning fees and this site survey and this, and it ranges from the statistics I was able to find in your book and outside was 10 to 30% of the cost of a house can be eaten up by bureaucratic fees, which when you're looking at a $900,000 house, you're looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars of essentially like government waste, bureaucracy added to.
It's not necessarily waste, Brian. I'm just going to jump in and say someone has to pay for libraries and schools and parks and a lot of public goods. But the problem is that the responsibility for that absolutely essential infrastructure, roads and water and sewer and public transit, has all been downloaded to municipalities who get 10 cents on the tax dollar. So what do municipalities do? Their choice is either raise property taxes, and property taxes are really unpopular, partly because they arrive in a lump sum. They don't anonymously come on your bill like a sales tax or off your paycheck like a income tax. Really visible. Or they put the charges on new development, saying growth should pay for growth. There's two problems with that. One is that growth is paying not only for new infrastructure, but also maintaining existing infrastructure, which benefits the people who are already there. And you're punishing a future generation, so to speak, the new renter, the new buyer, at the expense of the often more comfortable established homeowner or even established renter. So it's an unfair tax. It's regressive tax. It's also, having really large impacts on the affordability of housing. Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm probably not using the right verbiage. You know what I mean? When I hear 30% of a home is wrapped up in governmental fees, like my mind goes to waste right away because I just assume that they're not reinvesting it in libraries and they're not reinvesting it in public parks and, you know what I mean, upgrading existing. It seems like there's a black hole or a void of where the money often goes, and it doesn't seem to be benefiting the people like it should. I think if all that money was going where it should go, we'd probably all have flying cars and our own doctors at this point, but obviously we're not quite there yet.
Well, I mean, the place where I would agree that there's a lot of waste is that, I mean, I had a meeting today about 2 new definitions of what affordable housing is to add to the other 6 definitions of what affordable housing is. It's used by the same level of government, which is federal government. And that's not even counting provincial definitions or municipal definitions. And we really need a clear way to establish shared definitions, shared targets between the three levels of government. They all have a role. Federal government should be financing infrastructure because it has most tax dollars. Provinces should be making sure that everyone has a decent income and protecting tenants from being evicted without cause, and providing adequate health and social services for the people who need them. Municipalities should be doing approvals a lot faster and should have a much, much, much more simplified approach towards the right housing in the right places. So all levels of government are failing. And one of the ways that they're failing is that they can't even define the problem the same way, which is really outrageous to me.
That's not shocking, and I would definitely agree that all levels of government are failing. So we're on the same page with that one. I don't know if you saw the comment by the MP housing minister. I think it was about 2 weeks ago, Gregor Robertson, who said that the housing unaffordability can be blamed on the Iran war. I
No,
yeah.
I did hear something about that. And again, I think that there are some PR things that need to happen. I mean, certainly it doesn't make things better, but as I suggest, there's a whole bunch of reasons, some going back many, many years, 3 decades, 5 decades, that have worked towards housing and affordability. And, the Strait of Hormuz being blocked up is not having an immediate impact on housing affordability. It's having an impact at the gas pump, definitely.
Yeah, I would agree. Something that's about 3 weeks or a month old now, I don't think has an effect on the house price of 2025 or anything before that. So I just thought it was comically dumb that someone at that level is, just scapegoating here to try to deflect. But one of the things that I thought in your book that was really interesting that I'm definitely agreeing with you here is the Canada Post model with these, and not necessarily, it doesn't have to be Canada Post, insert whatever other organization, but the fact that you identified this 500 plus hub postal service that, could serve as sort of a focal point with building the community up and around it. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, housing has been built on top of libraries, on top of fire halls, which is fairly outrageous, to be on top of health centers or on top of schools. I could go on. So any place certainly a busy city, but even in a rural area where you see a one-story government building, you're looking at lazy land. You're looking at something that could, well, let's take the example of a relatively small town like Egansville, which is on the road to Algonquin Park from Ottawa. It has about 5,000 people, and the people who need adequate affordable housing could so easily be served by one building on top of a well-located but underused post office. So this is an idea that I've been trying to shop around since 2022, so 4 years now. And everyone thinks it's a great idea, but no one's doing anything about it. I will say that the federal government's gotten a lot smarter about use of its land, and many municipalities have gotten a lot better about use of their land. Provinces, particularly Ontario, are still not thinking that way, which is a shame. But that's one simple thing, one simple way to help housing affordability, particularly since, as I say in my book, there are post offices in every small, every northern, every Indigenous community in Canada owned by Canada Post that could easily meet the housing needs of a small community if redeveloped in the right way. And a lot of I'm not talking about 19th century heritage buildings here. I'm talking about things that were built with large parking lots around them in the 50s, 60s, 70s that need to be redeveloped, to make a long story short, But I still find that governments talk a lot about the housing crisis, but aren't sort of picking up on some simple things that make a big difference.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I thought it was a really cool model. And I even in the time that, and I know in your book you mentioned you lived in Parkdale, which I thought was really neat because that's the first neighborhood that I moved to after I graduated university. So I was sort of, I had firsthand exposure to some of the things that you were talking about of the way how that neighborhood of Toronto had kind of grown over the years and been subject to a lot of the same issues or benefits of what you mentioned in the book. And it just helped me relate to your story a lot better. And I thought that was really neat. Another thing that I thought was really interesting idea was your construction job idea, offering accommodation to the folks that are building the homes and giving them, I believe it was discounted housing or extremely affordable housings for the people that are coming up in the trades, can be trained to build homes and then sort of offered homes in the process. I thought that was another good idea. I think I'm butchering it a little bit, so maybe you can help me out.
No, I think you're right on, Brian. I mean, in the 1970s and 1980s, in the heyday of non-market housing, there were a lot of union-built co-ops and a lot of affordable housing that was built specifically to meet the needs of workers, sometimes in remote areas like mining areas, but often in places like Toronto where you need a lot of airport workers. So you build housing for the airport workers close to the airport kind of thing. So none of these solutions are like magic bullets or silver bullets or whatever, but all of them can and should be supported because everyone agrees that we need more affordable housing.
Yeah, it's very, the construction training idea is very similar to what goes on in the military when you're sent off to a base to go through training, or you get a posting, and then there's different levels of housing offered depending on the size of your family or what part of your career you're at. Like if you're still a student or if you're specializing or you're posted to that base and you've got now many years that you're going to be there, and they essentially give you affordable housing. The problem with, I would say they wouldn't give you affordable housing. I say they give you housing, because the problem in the military that I can speak to from experience is that many of these houses that are being offered to soldiers are very run down and dilapidated. Like I would use the term squalor for some of the things that I've been exposed to personally. And I don't think anyone's joining the military thinking that they're moving into the Ritz. I don't think that's the case. But I think that there should be a baseline level of dignity that's attached to being in the military and being a soldier, sailor, airman, woman. And you know what I mean? I don't think that what we're doing now specifically at D&D is the right thing. And I think there needs to be a major overhaul on the way that they provide housing to the military, because it's definitely broken and not working. Thank you so much again for being here today. I think I'm probably going to have to reach out to you again I have another page of notes here that I want to get
to. I think I'm going to get thrown out of the coffee shop soon, but let me say that I furiously agree, Brian. As I mentioned, there's a lot of folks in my family who are in the services, particularly in the Navy, and the state of the housing is absolutely appalling. One of my hopes is that with the increased investment in D&D, there might be the opportunity for a new generation of housing that's not only for the people who are serving, and it should be primarily for the people who are in the military, but also for the surrounding community. So I think my son's fond dream would be to serve out of Esquimalt, which is in Victoria, BC. And I would love to see an organization such as Habitat for Humanity, for instance, partner with DND to create affordable housing near the base, which could also serve a rapidly growing metropolis that desperately needs affordable family housing. So, there's our possibilities are only constrained by the kind of structures that we have now that clearly aren't working. So, if I have any kind of closing note on this chapter, it is let's think big and let's think about what we can do in the next few years in order not to ruin it for another generation.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Again, the book is Home Truths. I loved your book, folks. Pick up the book. There's so many good ideas, lots of
UBC
concepts
Press
there.
2024. And yep, it's been a pleasure talking with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'll be in touch again soon.
Patriotic means looking out for each other and fixing things together.
True patriotism is being in the country you love, surrounded by people you love, and great weather.
Being a patriot is being a part of your community and caring for it.
It doesn't matter who you are or where you're from, patriotism is the one thing we all share.
It's okay to be critical of government and still be a patriot.
It's gratitude to your country.
Of course I'm a patriot. I'm Canadian. It's my home.
Well, actually, true patriot love is the mission.